Yeah. Good evening, and welcome to the first of the national hustings in the Liberal Democrat leadership election. My name is Hugo Jai. I'm Deputy Political Editor of the I newspaper. Sadly, for obvious reasons, we can't be joined by a live audience here at this central London studio overlooking the Palace of Westminster. But I'm delighted to say that we are joined by the two candidates to be the next leader of the Liberal Democrats. Layla Moran is the MP for Oxford West and Abingdon. She's currently the party's spokesperson on education. Ed Davey is the MP for Kingston and Surbiton. He's been acting leader of the party since last December. As the UK emerges from lockdown and begins the next phase of the fight against coronavirus, the Liberal Democrats are also beginning a new era of their own. Tonight, we're going to hear from the two candidates for leader on their view and their plans for the economy and jobs. Obviously, a crucial issue now more than ever after the post-COVID recession. We're going to be here for about 80 minutes. There are 11 key questions, so that's just under 7 minutes per question. Most of these questions have been sent in to us by Liberal Democrat members. There's also one or two from iReaders and a couple that I've thrown in myself just to make sure that all the crucial broad themes are covered. I will be keeping the candidates to time, so that's a warning, and we may have to speed up a bit in the second half to ensure that we don't overrun the timing of the event. If you wish to post about this event on social media, and please do, then please use the hashtag Lib Dem Leadership. There's also a British Sign Language version of this debate, which is available through the Zoom link on the live stream page on the Lib Dem's website. Layla won the coin toss to decide who goes first, so I'm going to address my first question to her initially. I'm going to begin with two fairly broad questions. One of them's on the past and one of them is on the future. So first of all, did the coalition government's spending cuts go too far? Layla first.
Thank you. Well, I think back to that conference where many of us were, where we voted to go into coalition, and in good faith, we thought that we were doing the right thing, the country was in a crisis, and we absolutely had to take this opportunity to deliver on Liberal Democrat values in government. And I remember voting and thinking, boy, I hope this works. And as coalition progressed, and as we had to bear down on the deficit, and I think there was no argument politically, that is what had to happen. The Labour Party were also putting a manifesto that said that. It also became clear that despite us saying in our own manifesto that we wouldn't go in hard and that we wouldn't balance the books off the backs of the poor, there were times when that happened. And I think particularly to cuts to carers allowance, to bedroom tax, these were things that I don't agree were the right priorities. We needed to fight back harder because those are the very people who look to the Liberal Democrats and say, those are people who are on our side and we let them down. So did we do it all right? Absolutely not. But I think what we need to do now is, looking forward, show people that we've learned from the mistakes that were made at the time and that we are renewed as a party and that we will not return to austerity at this difficult time, and learn and move forwards together.
Okay, Ed, well, you were, of course, a cabinet minister in that coalition government. Do you agree with Layla that some of the cuts did go too far, that you shouldn't have agreed to cuts in carers allowance, to the so-called bedroom tax?
Well, Layla's right that the deficit had to be cut. I agree with her that she was right that both the Labour Party and all the parties went into the 2010 election saying cuts had to be made. The real story that hasn't been told, that needs to be told, is how Nick Clegg and Vince Cable fought against George Osborne successfully to stop much deeper cuts. And there were proposals from George Osborne to freeze benefits when the inflation rate was 5%. That would have been a disaster for the poor, and we stopped that. And one thing that I think we got wrong in the coalition, we failed to message the fact that we were stopping the Tories doing deeper cuts. And I think that was a big political mistake, and I think we paid the price. But there are some good messages which we should get over to people. taking millions of low paid out of income tax. That was a good thing, socially progressive. And I managed, through very careful management of private investment, to get nearly £300 billion energy investment, which created jobs and helped lots of communities. And so there's always two sides of this. Clearly, the real challenge is looking forward. And the good news is, I do not believe, from my training as an economist, I've got a degree in postgraduate economics, that we need to go back to cuts at all. 2020 is very different from 2010. Debt borrowing costs are much, much lower. The markets are willing to lend, and the Bank of England, crucially, is taking a different view. So looking forward, Liberal Democrats can make those investments in the economy to create those jobs, but also make the investments in our precious public services, in education, health and caring, where we need to be the champions of investing in public services.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. You talk about the idea that the Lib Dems stop the Tories from going further in coalitions, and not just the coalition of the past, but possible future coalitions, impossible future governments. Can the Lib Dems do more than just, on economic policy specifically, since that's the theme tonight, than just moderating the perceived excesses of the party?
Absolutely we can, and that's where I can show you that we managed to get £300 billion either invested or a pipeline investment in energy. That's what I did. That nearly quadrupled Britain's renewable power. It made us a world leader in offshore wind. I did that in the teeth of opposition from the Tories. George Osborne didn't want that, Eric Pickles didn't want that, and I fought them and I won. So I am actually living proof that if you stand up to Tories, if you fight the Tories, you can win for Liberal Democrat values and Liberal Democrat policies.
Well, Layla, what do you think? I mean, do you agree that the coalition was a success on those metrics, or are you just constantly going to be fighting a potentially losing battle as the third party against the extremes of the main two?
Yeah, well, this is what's worrying me a bit about what Ed's saying, because if we keep explaining the past, and Ed, you say that we didn't try and get those messages across, but as a candidate in Oxford West and Abingdon in 2012, I certainly did. I was on doors trying to make that positive case for all the good stuff that we were doing. We had the press team at number 10 and the whole of government press team trying to get that message across, and it failed. And in the subsequent 3 elections, we've woken up to disappointment. We are currently at 6% in the polls. Actually, we shouldn't be spending our time trying to own the past. Actually, we need to send a signal that we are renewed to the electorate and that we are forwards looking. And we lost their trust, Hugo. That's the thing that I keep hearing on doors.
And I agree, we shouldn't.
We lost their trust. And if we can't win people's trust back, then we don't stand a chance of having another election where we're going to make that great leap forward that we deserve.
I agree we shouldn't be talking about the past, and I'm not in this leadership election. I'm talking about the future, with a vision of a greener economy, a fairer society, a more caring society. I want to talk about Liberal Democrat policies for the future. There are people in this campaign who are trying to bring us back to the coalition, and all I'm saying is there's another side of the coalition which should have been told. And in my position, because I did nearly quadruple renewable power and I beat the Tories on climate, that would give me huge credibility leading the party, debating the green economy, debating, fighting and beating climate change.
Well, we just have to look at the last election. I mean, Joe Swinson, at that question time event with that Andrew Neil interview, the problem we have is that whether we like it or not, if we've got someone who is saying, I want to champion the poor, then the interviewer comes right back and says, well, why did you vote for something that did the exact opposite? And that's the shackle. And it's not fair, Ed. It's not fair, because there were things that were great that happened in coalition. I took Michael Gove to task the other day for trying to claim that the pupil premium was the Tories. It absolutely is something that we should be proud of. But now is the time to send that signal that we are renewed, to move forward once and for all. I'm sick and tired of hearing about coalition on the doors. I actually just want us to have that chance to attract the attention.
But it's not coming up on the doors. If in 2024, it's a bit ludicrous to say, post-Brexit and post-COVID, that this would be the issue.
Talk to our campaigners.
I think you don't want to hear any more about the coalition, either of you, arguably. So let's move on and talk about the future. And this is actually ultimately the same theme, really. This is a question from a Lib Dem member, Roger. He says, We know what the Conservatives and Labour Party are proposing for the economy post-COVID-19. What is the unique Liberal Democrat economic policy to return the country to health? So that's Roger's question. Why don't we start with Ed?
Well, I want us to be the champions of a green economy. I published a green recovery plan, £150 billion of investment over the next 3 years, with a green jobs guarantee and training for young people, a real expansion of insulation, so we've got a biggest green homes programme ever, green power, green transport, rewilding, using the nature and rolling back the attack on biodiversity so nature can help us tackle climate change. It's a very ambitious programme, but moreover, it's a programme that brings in the economic crisis with a climate crisis. It could make us very distinctive, and as someone who's shown you can deliver a green vision, I think I'd be the one to show that we could deliver that. And I think it's really exciting. And the other distinctive position about it, it's on a scale that is needed. The problem with the Tories and Rishi Sunak's economic programme, it's not fit for the challenge we face. We are facing potentially the deepest recession for 300 years. Job losses are going to mount in huge numbers. Businesses are going to collapse in huge numbers. And that's even before we Brexited. We need a really ambitious programme, and I'm proposing one, and it's linked into a very good Liberal Democrat theme, tackling the climate change.
Layla, what do you think? What's the unique Liberal Democrat economic policy that you couldn't get from either of the main parties?
So throughout this process, I've been talking about three main pillars in my campaign: education, the environment, and the economy. And on the economy, what I've been saying is that actually COVID-19 is this great opportunity. It's this moment in time, just like when we've had crises in the past, where there could be a new economic settlement afterwards, one that's greener, fairer, and more compassionate. And I've been talking about actually something we started talking about at the last election, but we need to pick up that mantle, and it's about looking again at if GDP is the right measure by which we measure success. People out there, when we're on the doors talking to people, what they care about is, do they feel that increase in productivity? Are they represented by us? They want to know that we get the bread and butter issues that they desperately care about. And when we know that going back to austerity or cutting welfare or anything that these Tories might do is actually going to have a detrimental effect on their well-being, well, we need another measure alongside GDP that stops that from happening. So just like Jacinda Ardern did in New Zealand, I think this country should have another suite of indicators that go around GDP that make sure that as we come out of this crisis, we build back better, and there is a country that is more prosperous, more liberal at the end of it. That is the liberal approach to this coronavirus crisis. And yes, it's going to be difficult. My God, is it going to be difficult. But we can be that light at the end of the tunnel for people. We can give them that hope and that forward-looking vision that's going to change this country for good.
Can I just ask you, you say you're concerned about the prospect of spending cuts to pay for the COVID-19 response. Well, the other thing that Rishi Sunak has been fairly heavily hinting at is tax rises. I know, Ed, you've said, and Layla, I imagine you would agree that there's no immediate need to pay down the deficit now in the same way as there perhaps was in 2010. But do you think the COVID crisis does require tax rises, and if so, what tax rises would you most like to see? I mean, are we talking wealth tax? Are we talking a greater increase in the income tax? Reforms to capital gains tax? What do you think is the sort of mix of policies you'd like to see, if we start with Layla?
Well, classic Keynesian economics says that right now is the right time to be investing, and that's the Build Back Better bit. But also that when the economy starts to do better, that's when you start to bear down on it again. And it could take 20 years, and there might well be some monetisation in that. The Bank of England has hinted that it might be considering that, but it needs to be very well regulated, because that, of course, has an effect on inflation. And yes, I do think tax rises are going to have to be part of it at that point. So not yet, my goodness, not yet. We cannot choke off any recovery that could be happening right now. I'm very much in favour of a more progressive taxation system, one where the richer pay and the poorer don't suffer. We are probably going to have to look at wealth taxes. Lib Dem members who are watching, yes, land value taxation and wealth taxes and all of these things. And of course, the job of the leader is to turn all of these taxation policies that great Lib Dem members are going to help to create over the next few years into something that's really translatable for people on the door, so that they know the basic principle that we are going to be there for them if they're in times of trouble. And actually, it's the wealthiest who are going to pay.
Ed, briefly, do you agree that taxes will be needed, if not right now, then in the near future, to rebalance the books?
I think tax rises in a year or two need to be considered. They partly need to be considered because we need to finance a big increase in public spending on public services, and that has to be paid for. So the last election, we talked about a penny on income tax to get £7 billion into the NHS and social care system. I think that should remain our policy. I think we need to champion the NHS and champion social care. And I think there are other taxes we need to look at. We had them in our manifesto in December. A capital gains tax increase, where people who've got loads of shares, who are very wealthy, they don't get the benefit of an income tax allowance and a capital gains tax allowance. It seems to me wrong that the wealthiest should get the benefits of two tax allowances when those of us mere mortals don't have those two allowances. So I think there's a case for reforming capital gains tax. And of course there's a case for closing those loopholes on those multinationals. I think big tech has got away with not paying its fair share of tax, for example, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Apples, and we need to be tougher on them. And I would also finally say, it's also about reforming taxes. So business rates is a disaster for small business. And our proposal, which has come from the Liberal Democrat Business and Entrepreneurs Network, to replace it with a land value tax, which Layla touched on, is a fantastic idea, very radical, and could really help small business and our high streets.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, again, focused on the response, the immediate response to COVID-19. The current government has announced it will be directly funding starter jobs in order to get young people into the workforce. Do you support this scheme? And would you like it to continue on a permanent basis? If we start with Layla.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for asking this question, because actually this is going to be one of the biggest issues that we're going to face in the years to come. Young people who are disrupted at the beginning of their career, we know from research shows that actually that disruption, that time when you might try one thing, find out it's not for you, then move to something else, their life chances can be affected forever. In fact, my very youngest brothers and sisters were affected by that in the 2008-9 crash, and it's taken them 10 years longer to find that first foothold on the career ladder. So broadly, I do think something like this is helpful, but the devil is going to be in the detail. What we know about this is it's 25 hours a week at minimum wage for 6 months. There was something like this tried before, and actually what the government found was that they couldn't get firms to take young people on. So I think the other side to it is that we need to have mass retraining. We need to make universities and FE colleges places of learning for longer. And we need to make sure that we don't have a generation of young people that are left behind right now, because I'm seriously, seriously worried about their futures.
Okay. Ed, what's your view on this scheme and on whether it's something that should be a permanent part of the political landscape?
It's in the right ballpark, but it doesn't go far enough. What we've learned from the high unemployment in the 1980s in particular, when there were years of high unemployment, is the scarring impact that can have on individuals, their mental health, their physical health, the scarring impact it can have on, particularly on young people. It can go with them for the rest of their lives. It can hit communities really hard. So we do have to tackle this, and I'm pleased the government has shown a sign that it wants to. But the particular scheme, I think, is not well constructed. First of all, it only allows for 6 months and 6 months of training. We need 12 months. All the evidence shows if you're going to get a young person into a job, really trained in a way which will give them lifetime opportunities, you can't be so short-termist. We've got to invest for the longer term. You ask whether this should become permanent. I think it depends on how successful economic policies are. If we can get back to a situation where the economy is really going and we're making this green transition, which I'm talking about, then maybe in 2-3 years' time we won't need such a programme. But for the moment, absolutely, we need to look after those young people. They must be our top priority when it comes to jobs.
Layla, you talked about retraining, and again, I assume this is an area where Ed, you would broadly agree that this should be a priority. Do you risk, though, falling into the trap of assuming that education is solely for getting the skills that you need for the job market? I mean, this is something that particularly I think the Tories get accused of, rightly or wrongly. Is there a risk that you can almost go too far on focusing on the need for workplace skills and ignoring that actually education is doing a lot of jobs that have nothing directly to do with workplace skills? How do you find the balance there?
Well, the liberal approach is to say to the individual, look, here are all these choices, and here are the tools to access them, and off you go. And I think it's not going to be one size fits all at all. Actually, on higher education itself, I'm seriously worried about the impact of COVID on universities, on higher education institutions may well need bailouts quite soon, because, as you point out, it's not just those who use education and then go off somewhere else. It's also the sector as a whole, and it's worth billions of pounds to the British economy. So it is going to be something we're going to have to look at. But more broadly, and actually perhaps looking at the other end of the spectrum, I'm also equally worried about those in their late 50s who might be losing their jobs at this time. I think to a friend of mine, actually, who lost his job in the 2008-9 crash, and that led to mental health issues, alcoholism, family breakdown. The impact of that portion of the workforce is really, really terrible, which is why actually the proposal that I put forward as Education Secretary at the last general election about lifelong learning accounts, so £10,000 for everyone at different stages of life, so that they can find that next thing that's going to make them bubble with enthusiasm and bring them forward in life. Actually, that is something that I think we should bring back, but possibly actually supercharge and not have it at 10,000, but have it at 20,000.
And Ed, what do you think? Is there a risk in the understandable drive towards retraining that we lose some of the other lose sight of some of the other important aspects of education?
I think you're right. We need to make sure that if people at this moment want to stay in education or go back to education, be that a adult education, FE college, university, that actually that is supported. And Layla's right, the university sector is on its knees. The FE sector is also in trouble. This has to be a priority. So they could, people could go back and learn new skills, but not necessarily deliberately and directly, immediately vocational. However, I think we need to remember one thing. Some of the young people who are going to become unemployed will want to actually work. And so we do need a scheme that speaks to that desire to work, to earn a living and to get training and get skills. One thing that I'm worried about in our education system more broadly is that it's too academic. There's not enough focus on vocational, on technical, on craft skills, on apprenticeships. And so many people want to have those practical skills. We're going to need them for the transition to a green economy. We'll need a lot of technical skills, with the heating industry, energy efficiency and so on. So here's a time to give those people those skills with a work placement. So yes, there's a balance, but let's not shy away from the technical, academic, vocational side of things. Let's not all be academic.
Picking up on that point, if I may, there's 1 million
Briefly,
young people who are potentially going to be unemployed by the end of this year. Mainly coming out of course, the leisure industry and the tourism industry, which are some of the worst affected industries from COVID. Actually, this is an opportunity to perhaps put them on a different path, potentially one that's actually higher paid. And in the medium and long term, there could be a reduction in inequality in the country if we get this right. So actually, this part of the plan, I don't think there's very much between us here, Ed. I think we're going to vehemently agree with each other.
Agree to agree. That's fine. Well, let's move on. Quite. The next question, again, is on a broadly similar theme, but with a slightly different emphasis. It comes from a Liberal Democrat member named Matthew. And by the way, any Lib Dem members who are watching can submit their own questions for all debates through the party website. Obviously, not everyone watching is a party member. Some of them will just be sympathisers or indeed not sympathisers, I suppose.
But they can also sign up to the party on the party website.
They can, yeah. Only members can send in questions, but please feel free to do that. So this question is from Matthew, who, as I say, is a Lib Dem member. He says job losses and lost future earnings and career prospects have fallen heaviest on the young, poor and women during the COVID lockdowns. What specific policy do you support to enable those in the early phases of their career, particularly young parents, who have lost their jobs and prevent widening intergenerational wealth inequality? So this is a slightly different topic to the last one, because this is not about people entering the workforce. This is about stopping people dropping out once they've entered. I think it's Ed's turn to answer this one first. So Ed, what's your view? Specific policies to stop people getting lost to the workforce after lockdown?
One of the things that we learned from the many failed policies of the Thatcherite Tory government in the 1980s, when it was tackling high unemployment, was it failed to realise that every individual person is different. And therefore, if you're going to create a set of policies, they've got to be personalised, they've got to be flexible, and they've got to have real advice and engagement with the individual person. If you just ask people to stand in line like there's some number, guess what? It ain't going to work. So the approach I would take, that Liberals should take, is we think about how we can get advisors, trainers, people with really good social skills to be engaging in the job centres or through the third sector, where you've got voluntary organisations helping people in their community, and understanding that person. What do they want to do? What skills might they be able to apply? How are their childcare responsibilities, their other caring responsibilities affecting their ability to work? So I don't actually think there is a one-size-fits-all policy here. That would be a real danger. I think we need to create a much more flexible approach, a much more flexible offer with a whole set of different options for people. Some of which will be training, some of which will be guidance about careers, some of which will be work placement. As long as there's a variety, then I think we'll tackle the problem.
Layla, what's your view? I mean, do you agree with Ed that there is no one policy that can on its own make a big difference, or do you think that there is actually something that you'd identify as?
There's going to have to be a suite of policies, and I should start by saying that I was actually quite surprised when the Tories came along with furlough. And I really welcomed furlough, and at every step of the way, when it looked like it was going to be stopped, pushed and pushed for it to continue. And I think they shouldn't be stopping furlough too soon, whilst we also accept that at some point we're going to have to come off it. And the problem, of course, with furlough is that it was disproportionately young people, women who were taking furlough because the higher earner was able to stay in their jobs and childcare was a big issue. So one of the policies that
the service industries were most affected, which disproportionately employed both young people and women, I believe.
Exactly. And one of the policies that I championed at the last general election that I developed over the 2 years prior was 35 free hours of free childcare, so that women in particular who bear the brunt still of those childcare responsibilities can know that there is somewhere of high quality that is safe for their child to go, so that they have the options and so that they can be as flexible as they possibly can. I'm seriously worried that unless we find a way of supporting families and those who are more broadly affected by this, then we are going to end up with widening gaps in both pay for young, for women, but also BAME, and that community is another one that is disproportionately affected by furlough.
You've both, obviously, as everyone I think across the political spectrum has done, welcomed the furlough scheme. Presumably you would accept that it does have to end sometime. Would you like to see more targeted sectoral support for the most affected industries, or is that not the right way to go?
Actually, I think that is exactly the right way to go. I think that stopping it in October, we're already starting to see redundancy packages come through. I think actually it's a very interesting time for the unions when people are working flexibly, when people aren't there together to have these discussions. What's going to happen to workers' rights at this time? I think it is a really important moment to make sure that we are, as a party, looking after the rights of those who are disproportionately lower paid, who are going to be perhaps the ones who are going to be made redundant first. And I think a lot of people resisted furlough because their concern was that unless you've got a foot in the door, then you're going to get forgotten about. So my view is that it should be extended flexibly. I agree that it needs to be also flexible in terms of hours and completely flexible for the individual so that they can balance it against their own personal circumstances.
What's your view? Is it time to move to a more sectoral approach over the coming months?
Totally, and that's what I've been arguing for. It was a great scheme, and for the wider economy it has to come to an end. But for the leisure industry, the hospitality industry, the events industry and so on, there needs to be something there. But I don't think we should let the government off. They've made quite a few mistakes in their COVID support schemes. The most egregious mistake is for the self-employed. I argued when they weren't even putting anything forward for a self-employment scheme, and after I called an urgent question in the House, 2 days later, they came up with a self-employment package, but we immediately pointed out the problems with it, and there were two big problems. If you've been self-employed for a short period, you weren't getting anything. And if you were a group of the self-employed who had limited companies and paid yourselves by dividend, you didn't get anything either. And that was outrageous, because I think the Treasury had this view that if you were in a limited company, that you must be somehow wealthy. But in my constituency, I know hairdressers, taxi drivers, builders, all who had been advised by their accountants to organise their tax affairs and their business affairs through a limited company.
Okay.
And they got no help. And I'm not going to allow them, the Tories, to get off with that. We've got to stand up for them.
Okay.
And they are the excluded people that Jamie Stone and others have been battling
It's
for.
time to zoom out slightly from the individuals to a question about the economy as a whole. As we face increased joblessness, should the Bank of England and the government put more emphasis on reducing unemployment, even if that comes at the risk of significantly higher inflation? So a way of doing that would be to change the inflation target or even drop it entirely and replace it with a completely different target for the bank, such as targeting nominal GDP. Layla, what's your view on this?
Unemployment is going to be the biggest issue that the country is going to be facing. We're looking at 1 in 10 people by the end of this year looking at being unemployed. We don't want to get to the situation that we were in the 80s. And I do think that the Bank of England is a small part in this. But the thing about this recovery is that we can't do this alone. There is no one part of our society that's going to be able to do this alone. And I would like to see a supercharging of the amount of money, for example, that the British business bank is able to give out to new companies so that they can drive that productivity. Because if you aren't fueling business, and if we don't become the party of small and medium-sized businesses, these are the entrepreneurs who are going to, work out how to create these new jobs. I think there is space for our party to be the party that's championing them. We did it before. We created the Green Investment Bank that then got wound up. That needs to be recreated. We should be investing in catapult schemes. Actually, a lot of this was done under Vince when he was business secretary. These are the kinds of ideas that we should be coming back to, but also make sure that we are at the same time rebalancing the economy so it's not just focused on London and the southeast, but it's also everywhere in all the regions.
Ed, what's your view? Is there a significant role for the Bank of England to play, even if it means risking higher inflation? Is that a...
Well, first of all, I think the Bank of England is absolutely crucial. It's got a major role to play. And we're actually meeting the Governor of the Bank of England tomorrow to quiz him. I want him to come and talk to us because it's crucial that we input into him. So I think it's got a huge role to play. It's already been playing a huge role. And the question is there this trade-off that you're assuming in your question between unemployment and inflation? And at the moment, certainly for the next 2 or 3 years, I don't see that. Indeed, if you read what the Monetary Policy Committee, that's the committee in the Bank of England who looks at it, has been saying, they don't see that either. In fact, we've got inflation figures today very low. And globally, it looks like inflation is very much under control, partly because all prices are low. So that actually gives us a huge opportunity to tackle unemployment. And I believe, I'm going to say this to the Governor of the Bank of England tomorrow, that we need to see that expansionary policies that they've put forward, where they've effectively printed money. Let's just call it in its normal term. It's often called quantitative easing. But they've been printing money, lending the government that money, and that's not a bad thing. I'd actually, however, like to take more democratic control over how that printed money is used, the quantitative easing is used. And I think that would certainly fund some of the climate change programs I'm talking about, some of the programs to tackle unemployment. So I think at the moment, when you look at macroeconomic policy, this trade-off between unemployment and inflation isn't really there, at least for the next 2 or 3 years. And we can be more expansionary with the Bank of England properly organised. However, you may be right that in 3 years or 4 years' time, it's a genuine issue for debate. If inflation picks up, I don't have a crystal ball, it might do. And you posed the question to Layla and me, was should we change the inflation target, currently at 2%? That's set by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'm attracted by one of the things you said, nominal GDP targeting. Sounds a bit techie, I'm afraid.
I think you're going to have to explain in about 15 seconds why you think it's a good idea.
Well, because it gets the balance between unemployment and inflation much clearer. So we can do this. I'm really positive about it, but we need to engage in that debate. And I think I bring my training as economist into that serious, deep debate we're going to have in the House of Commons over the next few years.
If I may just say,
Yeah,
I mean, I do think the issue with these conversations is to ordinary people out there, to people on doors, they don't make any sense, and we have to be able to, as a political party, translate that for them. The reason why inflation really matters is because when inflation goes up, as it has been doing, in fact, since 2016, it eats away at universal credit benefits. And with any kind of increase in inflation, if that's what the Bank of England wants to do, we also have to have a promise from government that that isn't going to bear down on those who need that money the most. Because unless you do that, you're going to end up with greater inequality. And for that, mother in her kitchen, balancing a baby on one hip, talking to her elderly mother on the other, who just wants to know, what does this mean for me? What they want to know from the Lib Dems is that we are going to be looking out for them.
Okay, I think, thanks for that. Time to move on, because we've reached the halfway point in this debate. A reminder to all viewers at home, if you'd like to post about this debate on social media, and we'd love it if you do, then please use the hashtag Lib Dem Leadership. We've got six more key questions to get through, so I am going to have to speed you up a little bit, and I will interrupt you, I'm afraid, if you go on too long. Our next question is from another Lib Dem member, John. John says, remote working is becoming more attractive for businesses. What policies would you campaign for to help employees adapt better in this situation? Ed?
Well, I've been championing flexible working, and I think that's where we need to go. And we need to make sure we're protecting the more vulnerable people in the workforce to be able to enjoy this. And I've been running a campaign for carers. Caring is a big part of my pitch. I believe we need to be more caring society. I believe Liberal Democrats should be the champions of carers. And if you look at where carers sometimes have challenges in their lives, it's when they're juggling their caring responsibilities with their work responsibilities. I'm patron of an organisation called Disability Law Service, and we've produced a piece of legislation which would give more protection for carers doing that juggling. And I think that's the sort of measure we need to see in this new world to make sure that carers and other more vulnerable people can enjoy this benefit of flexible working. I'm actually inclined to work with employers to make this an option which goes forward, because it's good for the climate, reducing demand for travel, particularly in cars, but also, let's remember, in planes, less people flying around the world. That's a really good step forward on climate. But also, it's good for families. Speaking as a father, it's great to be able to spend actually more time with my kids and not having to travel around. I mean, I know it would be nice to have hustings in person and to talk to Liberal Democrat members in person, but the one advantage I have through this, I'll readily confess, is I'm actually able to go home and be with my kids every night and be there in the morning. So I take from that remote working is family friendly, and therefore we should champion it.
Layla, what's your view? Do you think there are upsides to remote working, and how do you protect employees from the potential downsides.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are, and it's great if you do have a family and a good support network around you, but I've got some friends in this situation who have been alone through this crisis and working from home or furloughed alone while they were in lockdown. And remember, guys, we still don't know what the government strategy is before a second wave, what's going to happen. This could still come. I'm chairing now this APPG that's launching a parliamentary inquiry into coronavirus so we can try and avert it. If this happens again, mental health of the nation is going to be a really big issue. So I actually think we should be legislating to have people be able to request remote working and it be granted. And in fact, interestingly, having written to Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, I think last week he suggested that he was looking into it. But more than that, we need to be putting that support network around people.
Is there a risk? I mean, it's an interesting idea, legislating for a right to remote work, but is there a risk that that just ends up a completely unworkable requirement for businesses? I mean, obviously there are some jobs where you cannot work from home.
Of course.
I mean, is that a danger?
No, of course. I mean, if you're a builder on a construction site, of course that's not going to work, is it? But there are actually a lot of employers out there who are forcing their employees to come in. In fact, there was a study done by a university that showed that for call centre staff, at the beginning of lockdown, they had been classed as an essential workforce and were being forced to go in. And I was being contacted by people saying, I'm scared, I don't want to have to go in. And actually at this time, I think if people want to stay at home and they're well supported and they can do those jobs that can be done from home, then they should be allowed to.
Can I ask, would either of you support the idea of, for employees working at home, some form of compulsory payment, whether that was from the government or perhaps more likely from their employer, to help with the costs of working at home, the technology costs, which obviously reflect the fact that for most employers, having their workers at home is at least in the short term a saving. Is that the sort of idea that would attract either of you?
Yeah, I mean, what you're going to see is businesses making some savings on their property.
Yeah.
Commercial property is going to be in a bit of a problem because the need to expand office space, I think a business will actually welcome the fact that there's home working.
And so should they be forced to pass on the cost if they can?
Well, put it this way,
sorry.
Parliament has. So Parliament has increased the allowances for MPs, which, by the way, I have not used for myself, but actually passed on to my staff, so that if they need, extra broadband, desks, etc. Yeah. So frankly, if Parliament's going to do it, I actually think that is everyone should.
And do you broadly agree or not?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say they should be forced to. I think there could be some tax advantages for doing that. Yeah. But I think the real issue is broadband. Because if you're really going to promote home working, we've got to make sure that the whole country has the fastest broadband possible. And what I would do is I would cut the roads budget and I'd use that money to invest in broadband.
Shorter roads, greater broadband, got it. The next question is from another Lib Dem member, Yaska, who says, how would you propose to innovate the retirement age? Or possibly get rid of the concept altogether? Their words, not mine, so don't take too much issue with the premise. Layla, what's your view? Is it time to junk the retirement age or at least massively overhaul it for the new age?
Well, age is but a number, and certainly that's what my parents and grandparents tell me. And I think there is certainly a case for looking at, first of all, how can we make sure that our population is healthier as it gets older? We are an ageing population, particularly with the changes to the migration system, which mean that this country has now stopped some of those younger people coming in who are going to be propping up our economy. And that is going to be something that we are going to have to discuss as a country in the medium to long term. If that is going to be a consequence of Priti Patel's changes to the immigration system, then the consequence will be that it will be workers being there for longer. However, what we cannot get into is a situation like the WASPy women, where people are making decisions about their futures and all of a sudden it gets taken away and they aren't represented and they aren't honoured. So we absolutely have to look at it, but it needs to be done in a way that's fair and doesn't sell people up the river, which is exactly what happened to that group of people.
What's your view on that? I mean, do you agree, or does that mean that you can only phase these changes in over the course of an entire working life and therefore we can't make serious changes for 40 years? Or where does the balance struck, do you think?
Well, I've got some news to you. As a minister, I started the process. I got rid of something called the default age of retirement. Before I did that, people could be forced to retire by their employer, could be sacked once they got to the retirement age. I thought that was ageist. I thought that was discriminatory. And while the Tories fought me for it, I fought and won, and I made sure that the default age of retirement was abolished. So an employer no longer can sack someone just because they come to retirement age. I thought it was wrong. There was a number of reasons why I thought it was wrong. I thought it was wrong for individual rights, for people who still have wanted to work. But also it's wrong because I think it devalues the value of people who have got wisdom and skills. Yes, sometimes they may not be able to run as fast as they used to be able to, or lay bricks or whatever it may be, because age takes a toll. But it often doesn't take a toll on their minds. And that creativity, that advice, that wisdom that they can bring to their younger co-workers is something that we need to think about keeping in the workplace. And one of the reasons I won the argument, when I had a fierce argument with the Tories, who just didn't want to give this freedom to people, and I was determined to give this liberal freedom to people, was I said, look, this can be good for our economy. And eventually I won that argument in terms of productivity, in terms of skill base.
Is there a danger, though, that while encouraging more older people to stay in the workforce longer if they want to, as you both said, is there a danger that people feel unable to retire? Or indeed, is it just a fact that people are going to have to retire significantly later? And if so, how do you spread that message without actually people being shocked?
I think it's about giving people a real choice, and also recognising that by encouraging people to stay in the workforce longer, of course, then you have to make space for the next generation to come through at the same time.
So neither of you would support getting rid of the retirement age altogether, so that
I think we should look at it. No, I think it's really exciting, and we've got a changing economy. It's changing incredibly rapidly. We should be giving people complete choice, but actually their pensions and that basic amount of money that you need to live by, that's why I've been championing a universal basic income throughout this entire period, because I feel that that is one of the ways that we can prop up the state pension to make sure that no one falls through the cracks.
The biggest idea in this area, which I think does answer your question, is a proposal for a flexible decade of retirement. And you could bring that in of 10 years around the core retirement age. And what you could do, and in private pensions you can do this, you could step the pension down. So if you decided to retire earlier, you had a smaller pension. Yeah. And it was just done by the pension experts, the so-called actuaries, would do all the calculations. And if you wanted to, you could retire later and get a bigger state pension. So I'm actually attracted by the flexible decade of retirement because I think it just gives the individual more choice, and the state isn't saying you must retire on this day to get your state pension. But it's about the state pension. It's not just about the choice of working, because I got rid of the default age of retirement.
I really wish I could look at the sidebar of the YouTube right now, because I think this is going to be setting Lib Dem members alight with ideas.
Well,
so I'm really
that's the idea.
I think you've both proposed, relatively fair to say, radical policies in that area. Slightly different ones, but both radical. The next area we'll move on to, some would say that some pretty radical policies are needed here. One major economic problem facing Britain in recent years has been runaway house prices. How do you propose to keep prices under control and encourage house building in the next few years? It is Ed's turn to start.
Well, I'm very closely linked to this because my wife is a councillor and she's got the housing portfolio on Kingston Council, and she's wanting to build a lot more social homes. And I'm very proud of her because that's exactly what she is doing. And in my own constituency, I know how important that is, because young people, and indeed some middle-aged families, find housing just too expensive. And therefore, a big council house programme, a big social housing programme is what is needed, and that's what my wife is doing. By the way, I met my wife on a housing policy working group in 2003, so maybe I should get out a bit more, but we're very happy. And I learned a lot about housing from her. And the way she's approaching it is she's ensuring that the new council homes that are being built are zero carbon. And we've got some really exciting plans where you're hoping to use the energy from our local sewage works. And this sounds a bit odd, but we're hoping to use a program I brought in when I was Secretary of State for heat networks and use the energy from this waste site to heat all these new social homes, so they'll be green as well as affordable. And that's the vision I'd like to see. It does mean that Liberal Democrat MPs and Liberal Democrat councillors have got to be very supportive of development in their areas, and that will be challenging.
Okay. Layla, what's your view on this? How do you encourage house building and keep prices
I think it might
reasonable?
Surprise people to know that actually there is something I agree with Boris Johnson on,
Right.
which is that we should be building, or build, as he likes to say. But it needs to be genuinely affordable homes. And the problem at the moment is that, particularly in areas where there are runaway house prices, 80% of market value is not affordable. It's not affordable for anyone. We've got a development in Oxfordshire, just down the road, was meant to be affordable housing starting at 300,000 for a one-bedroom flat. Meanwhile, average earnings is somewhere between 26 and 28,000 in that part of the world. I mean, it's unconscionable that we have that happening. And the reason why it's happening is because local authorities are not empowered to be able to have set up housing trusts, that they can do it themselves. We need to be building more social homes. And our last manifesto said that we would commit to 100,000 social homes a year. But actually Shelter has estimated that really to keep up, we need 155,000 a year. And I would love for us as a party to commit to that.
You both said you support social housing. Is there a bit of a danger that if you concentrate solely on social housing, then you get, yes, enough housing at the bottom, and of course there's always enough houses, there's always enough houses for the multimillionaires, but then for the middle classes there's nothing, there's a sort of void. Isn't there a danger that if you only build social housing, you sort of leave open the territory for people who aren't eligible for social housing?
Look, if we want to go on a rant on the national planning policy framework right now, that would be another 90 minutes of time.
Yeah, keep that
but the point about that is that in order to build that many social houses and in order to have developments that meet this legislation, actually you do need to build those others as well. But by committing to that, that's the flaw. And the reason why that matters is because those are the people who can't get on the housing ladder. Those are the renters who are trapped right now. Those are the ones who we need to solve this problem for. So I think focusing on them is the right thing. But let's face it, the market is going to continue to build those homes that you suggest.
Fine.
And the other side to it, of course, is that if people then want to buy those homes, we don't fall back into what's been happening, which is the sell-off and then the not replacement. So you can have a churn of houses in that way as well.
The state has to come in here. The state has to use its power to make sure we have these social homes. If you leave it to the market, as has been done for far too long, they will build lots of homes, but they'll be out of reach for many people on low and modest incomes. And the market, just even if you have planning conditions on them, developers try and wriggle out of them. So I think the period where we've relied on private developers and planning gain, that shouldn't be the main way forward. Unless we build social housing at a serious number, I don't think we'll tackle the problem.
Okay, our next question is from iReader Dave Sanderson. He says, and this is an issue that we've touched on earlier actually, but he says, given that we cannot have indefinite economic growth on a finite planet, do you accept that GDP growth should be replaced as a national metric by enhanced well-being using a basket of measures of well-being? Layla, I think given your earlier comments, I might know your answer.
Yes, and it's exactly what I've been proposing.
And can you put some flesh on the bones
Sure.
of what that would be? Because
so
many people have said let's junk GDP and no one's yet come up with a fail-safe way of replacing it.
No, fair enough. And actually, to be fair, I have never said that we should junk GDP. It's just one of the many metrics that we should be employing in our economy. And the way this works, and there are actually a lot of people I'm very inspired by right now. Kate Raworth, for example, Donut Economics talks about this, and it treats the planet as a finite resource as opposed to an infinite resource. And it makes the case for investing in not just, roads and houses, but also recognizing that people are infrastructure too. But the way that New Zealand went about this, I think, is quite exciting. And they did a mass consultation across the whole country about what are the things that really matter to you. And indicators such as mental health, indicators like youth unemployment, like well-being indicators like that were part of it. And the reason why this matters, and I sat on the Public Accounts Committee for the last 3 years, and I saw it happen before my very eyes. When you are civil servants, should we invest in this? They're looking at the 1 in, 1 out. £1 in, £5 out. £1 in, £1.2 out. Actually, if you force them to look at these other measures at the same time, you may find that that road that you thought was going to drive economic productivity actually is going to have a negative impact on the environment, and then it starts to balance. And that's why we need that change, because it forces us to think not just in that short-term measure of GDP, which is so flawed in its many ways anyway, but actually to the medium and the long-term well-being of the entire country and the planet.
Okay. Ed, what do you think? Time to downgrade GDP?
Well, time to adjust it and time to have other measures too. And let me start with those other measures. We do have some measures that are constraining GDP, I'm delighted to say. They're called the carbon budgets from the Climate Change Act. And my concern about this Tory government is they're not investing enough in things like renewables, in things like the green economy, to ensure that we meet those carbon budgets. And they're wanting unconstrained growth. They're putting so much money into the roads programme. That's the wrong priority. And we have to make sure that our measures of success include climate at its very heart. And they also need, as Layla was saying, well-being indicators. And I was working with Jo Swinson was, I think, the champion of this. She spoke about it a lot. And she wanted, for our manifesto in December, to have a well-being budget. And I worked with her about what that actually mean. And one of the big examples is New Zealand. There are others as well, Bhutan and a few other countries where they've looked at this. And the great thing about the well-being budget that Jacinda Ardern has brought in is they have resulted in a shift of money. So it's not just about a metric. It's seen public spending move from areas that were doing no good for well-being into areas that are really helping. So, for example, they've seen much greater investment in mental health. They've seen much greater investment tackling domestic abuse. They've seen much greater investment in youth services. So a whole range of spending priorities has changed because of that. And I think that's quite exciting. I think that's encouraging. GDP itself, when I've looked at it as an economist and looked at the national income accounts that it comes from, the real problem is it counts things that we don't want to happen as goods. So pollution is positive to GDP. If you had a road accident out on the streets tonight and the ambulance came and the person went to hospital, that would actually increase GDP because GDP measures activity, whether it's activity that you want or not. So I've looked at this in some detail and believe that you can adjust GDP to take out those negatives. So it's actually more helpful than it is at the moment. But you still need the carbon budgets, you still need the well-being budgets.
Thanks. Well, next question comes from another Lib Dem member, Archie, who says, both candidates talk about a universal basic income. Current estimates suggest it would cost a lot. Bit of rhetorical understatement from Archie. As a party proud of our fiscal credentials, how do you suggest we could pay for a UBI, Ed?
Well, first of all, I wrote a UBI policy for the party back in 1990. We had it as a policy. We called it the citizen's income. And back then I did the costings, and it is possible. You can afford it. It depends how it's constructed. But now I think we have another advantage and something I'm writing about to show how we could pay for it. And it's what I call a sovereign wealth fund, using the COVID recovery plans to pay for it. Let me explain. The government has lent a lot of money to businesses across our economy. Many of those businesses either won't be able to pay that money back or will struggle to pay it back, and it will be a millstone around their growth. I think we should say to them, you have the option not of paying it back, but giving us, the taxpayer, the people of this country, shares in your business. And we will put those shares in a sovereign wealth fund, and the income coming from those shares over years would build up to help pay for a universal basic income. I'm really excited by this because we've not had this opportunity before, but because we've lent billions of pounds out across the country to small, medium and large businesses, here's an opportunity where the state can work with those companies, do something good for them, because they wouldn't have to pay the money back, they just have to give shares to this sovereign wealth fund, and those can be used for this universal basic income. Why do we want a UBI? To help carers, to help the unemployed, to help the most vulnerable in our society. And wouldn't that be fantastic to use this COVID recovery, this sovereign wealth fund, to help the most vulnerable? That's what I'd like to argue for.
Layla, what's your view on how a UBI could realistically be paid for?
Well, my journey to UBI was actually slightly different, because I would describe before COVID-19 UBI curious. I liked the idea of it. And I was concerned about how do we pay for it, because actually it is eye-watering sums. But actually and Archie, I want to tell you what happened. The day that we went into lockdown, I had triple the number of emails in my inbox, largely from people who had just lost their jobs, who couldn't make ends meet, who found themselves in a situation where that 5-week wait for universal credit was just not going to cut it, and they were in tears. And the question actually I think we need to ask now for the duration of COVID-19 is we need something like a UBI. How can we not be doing this? Because this is the moment where we can start to introduce it. And I suggest we do it at a slightly lower level than a fully, and there's actually as many different versions of UBI as you may want. But Compass, for example, is a group that's done a lot of work on this, started at around the £40 to £80 a week mark. That would be enough to put food on the table, pay the basic bills, stop people worrying about that kind of thing. It would need to be in addition to housing allowance and other types of benefits that we have. And we could start to claw the money back from the very wealthiest by closing some of those tax loopholes. And that's where we start. And then that builds up the data. I used to be a scientist, a science teacher. Let's look at the data for how something like this would work in our country. And then when we're through this crisis, then we can make a decision, having put in the infrastructure in place, as to whether or not it's something that we want to keep. But I would suggest let's do it now, while we've got this chance, and then decide later if it's the right thing to do for the country. And I suspect that once we start it, we might like it.
Can I just pick up on something that Archie said in his question? He said that you're a party proud of your fiscal credentials. Layla, you described the party as the party of business earlier. Ed, I remember during the last general election campaign seeing you give a speech in Leeds where you said a very similar thing. In an election campaign where the Labour Party was led by Jeremy Corbyn and the Conservative Party was pursuing a project, Brexit, which was really quite unpopular with the business establishment, you didn't make a breakthrough. You couldn't convince voters and businesses that you were the party of business, even in those extreme circumstances. How can you do it now?
Well, first of all, during Brexit, actually, there were huge numbers of businesses who were coming to us and indeed donating to the party, because they could see that what we were saying on Brexit was the right thing. And actually, thank you for bringing up Brexit, because it really does matter to the economy, and it's still coming.
So I will say there is a Brexit-focused hustings in future, which is why we haven't touched on it too much.
Fair enough, but it does matter to the economy, because that's the second shock that we just don't need right now. And I would argue that actually a lot of businesses did look at us and saw that we were a party that was working in their favour. But actually what I argue for is that liberal sentiment of the small guy, it's the small business owner, it's the small businesses that we need to be targeting. Actually, we've never really done that in the same way. And I argue that that is now that wide open space for our party. Up and down the country, those people who want to start business, they need to be supported, they need entrepreneurial loans. We need to make sure that the government is able to lend to them, ideally through local government, because of the grants that have been happening recently, actually, there's never been a better register for where our small businesses are than we have right now. This is exactly the moment that we should be doing this. I'm not hearing the other parties talk about it at all.
Ed, what's your view? If you couldn't get this argument past Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, how are you going to get it past Keir Starmer and maybe, who knows, Rishi Sunak at the next election?
Well, I think we are the natural party of business. We're a party that does understand enterprise, that does understand free trade. And businesses were supporting us at the last election, but I'll tell you the biggest barrier to them was they were worried about Jeremy Corbyn. In a lot of the seats that we need to win, and we needed to win last time, they were Tory Liberal Democrat marginals. And lots of Tory Remainers, including business people, they wanted to vote for us, but they were so scared of Jeremy Corbyn, and he scared them off. Now, the great thing, actually, is that I don't think Starmer will necessarily scare them off. So we should remain focused on trying to win those votes, because I want to make sure we win next time. And if we can be the party of business, which I believe we are, and we communicate that, I think it's not just Brexit that will bring businesses to us. I think it's their handling of COVID, which has been so disastrous for our economy. I think it's the way that Johnson treats business. So I think it's an open goal for us. And yes, we absolutely should talk about small business and the self-employed. It's one of the reasons I've been championing them through the COVID period. But I don't think our ambitions should stop there. Those people who export, those businesses that export around the world, who are going to face all those problems at the borders, all the costs of Brexit, the 7 billion Tory Brexit tax from the administration forms at the borders. When those exporters see that tax on them every single year, they're going to want to know which party wants to get rid of that. So I'm so excited about this opportunity, the self-employed, the small businesses, but businesses in general, and we have got to go for that vote.
Okay, let's move on for our final key question into the future, past COVID, past Brexit, past the next election.
Wow.
Peter, another Lib Dem member.
Over the rainbow.
Peter asks, how do you suggest we harness AI technologies for the benefit of the economy and jobs rather than risking further unemployment? Layla.
Thank you. I mean, first of all, my view as a Liberal is that I embrace change. That is actually one of the things we're really, really good at as a party. And when these changes are coming, we need to support our country going through them, but we shouldn't be afraid of them. However, we need to be aware of what's going on. And in fact, one of our Lords, Tim Clement Jones, in the Houses of Parliament, led an inquiry into this, where they were looking at 40% of jobs in the economy changing as a result. Now, there's a difference, of course, between AI and automation, but I'm presuming that the questioner is talking about automation here. We can use this to our advantage. You know, if we've got people who are now going to find themselves having to adapt, well, first of all, as a government, we would need to make sure that that was in place. You know, small and medium-sized businesses who maybe aren't on that digital journey yet. I would argue COVID has maybe supercharged that a little bit, and it's forced businesses to adopt ways of working, but also digitized ideas that they might not have done before. One of the areas that I'm really very excited by is potential changes to the currency. We've been dabbling in an idea, and in fact the Bank of England, I understand, is doing a study on it right now, digital currency for this country. And what's interesting about it is that it could potentially bypass money that goes from the state through the banks to the people, to actually go directly to the people, so that those who are unbanked or can't get access to that finance or can't get access to that help can get it directly. The ways that AI, in its broader sense, could help inequality in our society is brilliant, but we need to be the party, I think, that really champions this. And of course, the other side to it is there's all sorts of issues that we're still facing. You know, Digital Bill of Rights is one of the things that I've been focused on a lot. We've seen an economy that has moved from paper-based systems to digital systems. We sell our own data all the time. We are monetized, and yet we don't have regulation for this. So I think we should be the party that champions digital rights as part of this change.
What do you think, Ed? How do we stop the, if you like, rise of the robots from putting all of the humans out of a job?
Well, it's like we've got to embrace it. We can't be Luddites. There's so much technology development at the moment, not just AI. You look at virtual reality technology, you look at blockchain technology, and in energy there's huge advances. And I think we have to embrace that. The real question is, what do you do with those people who try to capture all the profits from these new technologies? And I think where there is a really serious economic problem, which we do have to address, is to make sure that we don't see just a small number of firms and a small number of people becoming fabulously rich out of this, and the rest of society actually not gaining at all. And if you actually talk to some of the real entrepreneurs in this, Elon Musk, he actually talks about a UBI. If you talk to Bill Gates, he talks about a tax on robots. You know, the big thinkers in this area are addressing some of the real economic challenges. So yes, we need to embrace it, but we need to think about the policies that are going to make sure it doesn't make the rest of the population less well off. Now, that's partly training, partly retraining, partly taking the huge opportunities for data sciences and technologists. But it is also being clear that this will push money to a small number of companies and people, and we have to find a way of that coming back into society so we can pay for carers. And I think this is interesting because if we have this extra wealth coming from technology, let's make sure we share it with everybody so we still can have a really fun and caring society.
Do you agree with that? Are you worried about increasing concentrations of power, particularly among sort of tech billionaires? And if so, very briefly, if you will, how can the British government do anything about that?
Yeah, I think actually this is something we need to take incredibly seriously. And my concern is that it's happening around us all the time, that we are giving our data away and getting nothing back. And there's been some really interesting suggestions. For example, should we be paid for our data? My own view is that this is something that needs a big commission and piece of work from the party. We have in our manifesto a digital bill of rights that would cover this kind of thing. And it's time that we put that flesh on the bones, because by the time we get to the next election, I think we are going to be looking at a much more digitized economy. But that way that it infringes on your civil liberties as a human being, that's the bit I'm seriously concerned about. And what it means is that there is no such thing anymore as a safe place for us. We are constantly being surveyed, we're constantly being looked at, we're constantly being used. I think that perhaps some way of feeding back into the state and feeding back directly to the individual might be the answer.
Okay.
Can I just comment on this?
Yeah, very briefly.
It's really
please,
important. Layla's right. This is our data. And they should pay us for it. They can't just use it for marketing and targeting us with their various messages. We can't allow these big tech, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, to control all our lives. We need to feel the benefit from it. So we need to be strong against these big tech US companies.
Okay. That's all the questions we've got time for. We'll now hear a closing statement from each of the candidates, where they will each have 2 minutes, no more please, to sum up their vision for how the Liberal Democrats can push for policies to help the economy and increase the number of jobs available. We'll start with Layla.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you to you all for tuning in and listening, and I hope you found it enjoyable. And the first thing I'll say is that whilst we've been standing here giving our view, actually what we need to do as a party is to recover what Paddy Ashdown used to call a party that was fizzing with ideas. And actually, as I've been touring the country by Zoom, listening to members, I know that fizz is there. But in order to show people that we can deliver on these ideas, whether it be a well-being economy that I've been talking about, whether it's retraining that people will need through COVID, whether it's better education that makes children world ready, not just exam ready, where they're not going to be afraid of these changes that are coming, where they learn to embrace the big questions rather than being worried about getting the wrong answer, where we are embracing a greener economy, one that is going to supercharge this recovery. And in fact, all the evidence shows that by driving a green economy, we're going to do even better than if we didn't. These are the big ideas. But in order to deliver them, we're going to have to regain trust. And we're going to have to show that as a party, we are renewed and that we are credible. Not delivering based on when we've got the levers of Parliament and government behind us, but actually delivering from the position that we are now. And that is what I do. I delivered the coronavirus compensation scheme from start to finish, and now bereaved families through this process, through this horrible COVID crisis, get £60,000 more than they might not have done before. I'm leading the parliamentary inquiry into coronavirus. I'm a doer. And we need to recapture not just the minds of those voters, we need to now start by recapturing their heart. And I believe if we can communicate that bold, liberal, forward-looking, enthusiastic vision of Britain that is uniquely Liberal Democrat, then people will vote for us again. So please, vote for me in this leadership election and let's move forward together.
Ed.
I believe I have the vision and experience and judgment to lead our party to start winning again, beating the Conservatives and being a party of power. And when I bring that vision and experience to the question tonight, economy and jobs, I believe I can articulate that and have the credibility on that so we can win in this key debate. Let's face it, the economy is going to dominate our politics over the next Parliament and probably way beyond that. We're going to see a big increase in unemployment. We're going to see some of the most challenging economic times we have ever seen. And so we need to step up to that challenge with a vision and with experience. And the vision, which I've articulated tonight, is bringing the economic challenge with the climate change challenge, building a green recovery plan, getting a green jobs guarantee for our young people, getting those green homes, that green power, that green transport, that rewilding of nature, which could both power our economy so we move from a polluting economy to a clean economy and give real hope for the future. But it's not just a vision. To deliver that and to be credible in those media interviews, to cut through, you need to have experience. I'm an economist. I did my degree in economics. I did my postgraduate at night school. I was Paddy Ashdown's senior economics advisor. I've been on the Treasury Select Committee. I've been involved in Lib Dem economic policy where it really cut through. The penny on income tax for education, for example. And I believe I can bring that experience with my vision to the service of our party. I believe through that we can start beating the stories, start winning again, and really serve our country to get our economy green and to get those jobs for our young people.
Thank you to Ed Davey, to Layla Moran, and most importantly to all of you watching at home. The two candidates will be back this time next week to discuss Britain's place in Europe and the world with Kate Devlin of The Independent. I've been Hugo Jai. Good night.